Well, good evening, everyone. Brenda, can you nod if you can hear me? You can see me? Okay, good. Um, my name is Jeb Livingood, and I'm the Associate Director of the University of Virginia's Creative Writing Program. I'd like to welcome you to our final webinar talk with this year's Kapnick Distinguished Writer in Residence, Brenda Hillman. After weeks of ice and snow and rain here in Charlottesville, we had a beautiful sunny day today with a high of 68 degrees, and it seems a fitting and beautiful night for our final Hillman lecture. In just a moment, Andy Eaton, one of our Master of Fine Arts students, will introduce Brenda more formally, but I'd like to highlight her role as a Kapnick Writer in Residence, which means she will be in residence at UVA all this spring, virtually. In addition to tonight's lecture, she will give a reading of her own poetry on April 7th, which will have a separate registration link. We are recording these webinars and we'll be releasing each one on YouTube with roughly a 1-week delay. I hope to post the second webinar by tomorrow, and I'll be emailing all the registrants the link to both the first and second webinar tomorrow, and I'll also include a registration link for Brenda's poetry reading in that email. Kapnick writers and residents come to UVA through the generosity of the Kapnick family, which established this residency to bring writers of international stature to the university for extended stays reminiscent of William Faulkner's legendary time at UVA in 1957 and 1958. Tonight, we'll try and have a brief question and answer period at the end of the talk, and you can send in your question by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Andy will read those questions to Brenda at the conclusion of her talk. And with that, I think I will turn things over to Andy for a proper introduction of our guest.
Welcome, everyone. It is both a joy and a sorrow for me to welcome you tonight to the third and final lecture in Brenda Hillman's series of talks as our Kapnick Distinguished Visiting Writer here at the University of Virginia. Brenda Hillman is the author of 10 poetry collections. Her work has received many awards, including the Griffin Poetry Prize, an Academy of American Poets Fellowship, and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. She holds the Olivia Filippi Chair in Poetry at St. Mary's College of California, and she is a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. This is the week Lawrence Ferlinghetti died, a champion of Bay Area poetry. I think tonight of Brenda's lecture coming to us now from that seat of innovative poetry, how her work remains heated by those fires. In the New York Times video, Ferlinghetti's window at City Lights bookstore is filled with a hand-painted sign, "Where's the rage?" If it is anywhere, it is in Brenda's poems and these lectures on the realm of making and imagination and words, a rage that is full of the generosity and devotion of the earth and water and air and fire and, of course, lichen. Brenda Hillman's is a poetry of vernacular imperative, by which I mean that she uses our actual language to say many of the things we've wanted to say and felt to be both true and uncertain about our relation to the world. Rather than a further list of her very many accomplishments, for tonight I choose a brief litany of dinner table conversation as my household has reflected on our Wednesday nights with Zoom Brenda. She lets the light into our house. She holds revelation so effortlessly in the palm of her hand, just offering it to you. It's like she just knows what needs to be said and has no problem saying it. I love how she thanks everyone. It's clear that she loves them and that counts for something. She makes me think. Her talks on poetics have entered our daily rituals these last few weeks. And Hillman's poems know themselves that the environment is a dangerous abstraction, and the words we use are bearers of their histories. For the past 2 weeks, and now this evening, Brenda has led us through 4 of the 6 M's of poetry: metaphor and metonymy, meaning and mystery, and tonight, magic and morality. She has defined such terms and tropes, pinning them to our understanding while renewing our wonder, the fruitful ignorance which becomes our reading and our lives. In light of her distinguished vocation as a seminal figure in experimental lyric invention, I remind myself of her reply to my initial email, which began, "Dear Professor Hillman," to which she replied, "Please call me Brenda," 2 exclamation points. I'm reminded as well of a principle she's offered us here, revise toward strangeness. It is painted now on the walls of my heart. Please join me in welcoming Brenda Hillman.
Thank you, Andy. That was just lovely and so heartening and gorgeous. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Please let me know if anything is amiss. Well, thank you for your generosity and to everyone for coming. I'm going to do my usual thanks plus a few extras tonight before I read my talk. I want again to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Chichenyu Ohlone land in the East Bay of California. And again, to thank the Kapnick family for your wonderful gift and the creative writing program and the English department and all of the incredible students, undergraduates and graduates who are welcoming me into your classes and your community. I've been loving reading your poems so far. Thanks especially to Lisa Rusbar and to Jeb Living Good, who have just been so stalwart. Again, thanks to my family of origin, my brothers and their wives, and my beloved mother for your inspiration, your help, and to all the friends who have been supporting Bob and me through this year while I've been working on these talks. You've just been priceless to us. I want to especially acknowledge 2 artists who are just in my heart, 2 women artists. My 50-year-long friendship with artist Frances Lerner, whose work gives me daily inspiration, and the musician Joni Mitchell, who I listen to very often. I'll never meet her, but she's in my heart. And since tonight I'm going to be speaking to political and moral issues, I want to thank particularly some women activists, the women of Code Pink, who I'll talk about, especially Janet Wheel, Medea Benjamin, and poet Allison Hedgecock. Thank you for your activism. To Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, founders of Black Lives Matter, and the climate activist Greta Thunberg. You've inspired me in incredible ways this year. And as Andy mentioned, I want to acknowledge the death and importance of Lawrence Ferlinghetti in his life. I hope to read one of his poems after the Q&A, perhaps. He's been very important to me since high school. Thanks especially to you all, audience, for coming to these talks and for your interest and also for your wonderful emails that you've sent and comments. I'm more than happy to have had such a great audience. Number 3, magic and morality. So Jeb will be, as we did last time, Jeb will be showing my visuals. Every morning I wake up and talk to my orchids. Their names are Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Verlaine, Mallarmé, Apollinaire, and Breton. A previous Rimbaud died because I overwatered him. The others are doing well. Mallarmé and Verlaine have put up new spikes, though Mallarmé has a suspicious yellow leaf. John Ruskin warned poets against the pathetic fallacy, putting false feeling into non-human nature. For me, this naming is a form of friendliness. Do the orchids hear my morning greeting? No. Do I believe the orchids have experiences? Depends on what an experience is, but it is certainly not the same as mine. Are my orchids inspirited? Yes, if the idea of spirit can be a loose metaphorical concept that shows respect. The title of tonight's talk is Magic and Morality, and I will share some examples of poems with moral force. We'll speak about some of the activist work I've done, and we'll try to relate it to writing and reading practices for your own work. When I conceived of these 3 talks as a toolkit for a functional imagination in times of crisis, I suspected this 3rd topic might require the largest stretch. Magic seems far from morality, but I hope you've seen in both of the previous lectures, metaphor and metonymy, meaning and mystery, that there are some connections. What is called a moral life, living according to a set of values that might bring good for others, is not considered a forte of poets. Poets like to misbehave, and so do our dream lives. The anarchist tendencies of my own imagination are often in conflict with my ethical values. Even great political poems, Blake's London, Ginsberg's Howl, Audre Lorde's Power, that stake moral claims clearly sometimes express conflicting emotional registers. Human communities assemble moral systems based on rational laws, but symbolic worlds of art and myth often begin with uncertainty, turbulent emotion, and ungovernable impulses. For Plato, poets don't even belong in the Republic because we are liars and imitators. Poets mostly don't specialize in adulthood, although we can do fairly convincing adult imitations, reading warning labels on food, stopping at traffic signals, occasionally apologizing to our loved ones for our malfeasance. My own creative life is lawless, with magical concepts woven into my days that seem overly full of responsibility. So this requires juggling opposing models of reality. In a vigil I organized at my place of work for 15 years, I had secret conversations with oaks, lichens, beetles, and mosses, as well as with the souls of dead writers who joined us. I named my introverted practice crypto-animist activism, a term that appears in a wonderful book edited by Linda Russo and Martha Reed called Counter Desecration, a glossary of terms for writing in the Anthropocene. And that's down below this vigil picture. This is the cover of their book. It's a really amazing book of glossary. As I noted in lecture 2, we're shrouded in mystery. The universe is 68% dark energy, 27% dark matter. So by my poet's math, we know 95% of nothing about anything. It's hard to understand how humans became so arrogant. Tonight, I will begin with some very short poems of penetrating moral vision. These exquisite works, written in 5 lines, 2 lines, 2 lines, 1 line, and 9 lines, respectively, demonstrate how poets can write politically or morally in compact spaces. Let's start with an iconic piece by Randall Jarrell, Death of a Ball Turret Gunner. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Spoken in the posthumous voice of a young airman killed in action in World War II, written in accentual 5 stress lines until the last line, this is one of the great anti-war poems. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state. To be a soldier for the state, capital S, but with lowercase state intended, is to fall precipitously from non-birth to non-birth. Only in line 4 is the young soldier briefly alive, black flak, nightmare fighters. The image of the gunner falling from mother's womb to the unborn state of the war, a furry fetal presence, brings tears to my eyes. The poem's efficiency allows the reader to register what has happened as the unborn soldier vanishes in the coffin womb of history, where gestation and birth are coterminous with death. An equally powerful piece, Brevity, by Camille Dungy, deploys one grammatical fragment of 12 words. Brevity, as in 4 girls, Sunday dresses, bone, ash, ash, bone, ash, bone. This is an homage to Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson and Carol Denise McNair, who died in the Birmingham 16th Street bombing, September 15, 1963. With flawless precision, Dungy calls up the memory of 4 girls in 2 lines with 3 units of perception. It is a micro-sonata of memory, an elegy, and a poem of moral outrage. 6 words, 3 words repeated twice after the colon, bone, ash, ash, bone, ash, bone. The poet uses a single moment of inversion to achieve surprising power. The expected order of the words would, of course, have been bone, ash, bone, ash, bone, ash. But in Dungy's poem, the word ash is framed by the word bone, rendering the physical fate of the children even more heartbreaking in this unexpected reversal. The rhetorical device is called apozeuxis, the word repeated in quick succession. The poem's transformative authority omits all excess. It seems to allow an implied space for a different outcome. Another 2-line poem, this one by Korean poet Kim Hae-soon, gorgeously translated by Don Mi-chae. The drawings in the book are by the artist Fee Jae Lee. Already, day 28. You are already born inside death. Echoes 49 times. Kim Hae-soon's autobiography of death is a socio-political history of violence by means of 49 linked shamanic and allegorical poems. This poem is an entry in a notebook death has kept throughout Korea's turbulent past. Images of death emerge and retreat dramatically, empowered in their journey by repetition. In this entry from the notebook, the sense of an individual destiny is overwhelmed by the endless and cumulative power of death, echoed 49 times, and silenced by white space. The sequence is saturated with profound color and energy, even as each day's entry presents the macabre and the catastrophic, a consolidated fate brought about by war and suffering. And a 1-line poem by Arthur Z., whose book Sightlines has a series of single-lined, untitled poems that enact a relationship between the natural beauty of New Mexico and the making of weapons in that region. Some of the poems are set off by dashes, as is this one. A man who built plutonium triggers breeds horses now. These riveting singlets appear throughout the book as standalone poems, and they also form a continuous poem with the force of a single brushstroke. Here the phrase plutonium trigger, 4 syllables, then 2, is abstractly graceful, even as it describes a weapon unleashing meaningless terror on the voiceless landscape with the horses. The line tells of the maker of compressed explosives, who now makes new animals, suggesting that creation in and of itself is raw energy, not necessarily in service of moral outcomes. And this is the opposite of a preachy or polemical poem. Bob Hass's little book on form offers satire as one of the 4 categories of poetry and includes most political poetry in that division. He notes that the word satire comes from satura, a Latin word for a mixed fruit stew. Listen to the satiric tonal mix in a 9-line, 21-word poem by Amiri Baraka. Monday in B flat. I can pray all day and God won't come. But if I call 911, the devil be here in a minute. This bitter satire tells the history of violence against Black people in a single metaphor by equating law and state authority with the devil. I need hardly say that this poem has, alas, lost none of its relevance. You can see in these 5 succinct examples the ways in which the power of poetry can demonstrate visionary and moral force, warning and terror in just a few lines. Like many of my generation, I was politically active in the 60s and 70s, but the activities I will describe tonight began after 9/11. And I have to say, there's one picture of me in my bra, so if there are children watching. My main concerns have always been the same. There's too much war, there's too much economic, racial, and gender inequality, and Earth is increasingly in peril. In the 90s, my generation was largely asleep to justice issues. I was dismayed by how few white people my age were taking any action outside the comfort zone of their own family interests, even as people of color and whites in the working class were struggling. Some friends on the far left were waiting for the revolution with passive despair. After the US invaded Iraq, I fell into a profound depression. When Bob and I were visiting Berlin, I had a somatic experience standing in a courtyard near a train stop where Jews would be carried to Auschwitz. I felt the eyes of apartment dwellers peering down from their windows, piercing my body with painful light rays. When Bob and I got back to the US, I felt I had to stop being so sensitive. I joined a group of war tax resistors. This is one of my letters to the IRS with the part highlighted. I joined a group of war tax resistors for several years, but just ended up fighting with the IRS through computers. Just to comment on that, I spent quite a few hours on the phone with human beings, and then at a certain point they switch you over to computers, and basically your tax resistance becomes just with a machine. Soon I found Code Pink, a grassroots group of women activists who were organizing to work in Sacramento and DC against the wars. Our first state campaign was to lobby the state legislators to pass HAR 36, a resolution to bring home the National Guard troops home from Iraq. I used to climb the steps in Sacramento and visualize language for new laws in washed up earthworms. In the years that followed, I traveled frequently to DC with my women friends to protest the wars. Our goal was to show up in our bodies as women in the so-called zones of power. I often took red-eye flights so I could visit offices on Friday without missing class. Some women in our group had given up jobs and had left loved ones to do this grassroots justice work. Many risked multiple arrests and did jail time. Many were mothers and grandmothers, teachers, and working class women. We attended congressional hearings, organized, phoned, and faxed. We did sit-ins and die-ins, did civil disobedience, sang in the Capitol Rotunda. In one colorful action, we showed up at the Justice Building for the federal trial of Scooter Libby, George Bush's scoundrel assistant. By the way, he now looks like sort of a hero because of what we've been through, but George Bush. We were told we couldn't go in wearing pink shirts, so we took off our shirts and stood outside until they let us in. And it turns out the Constitution doesn't state that you cannot wear pink in a federal building. At the Democratic Convention, Janet Weil and I read poetry in the free speech cage. It was called the free speech area, but it was actually a large cage, to a group of cops who were in the cage with us. The street theater aspect of this movement was ridiculed by some in the media, but the critiques have always seemed to me misogynistic. I was confused about how to be a poet in those years. I always took my notebook and sometimes drafted lines during the hearings or in the Capitol grounds, took notes on the non-human creatures. One afternoon, I interviewed dead bugs on the Capitol carpet and recorded those remarks. In a committee room in the Rayburn building, there was a fly buzzing around the room, and I thought of the goddess Ishtar. Maybe the fly could be included in a poem, not just the data about the arms sales. In my records, the names of the congressional bills merged with species and endangered life forms of the Anacostia River watershed near the Capitol, the mosses and lichens clinging to buildings, the fungal spots on plants in the offices. I realized many thought layers could be included in political actions and in poems. In Lafayette Park, poems could be whispered to the air and to rocks, remembering the history of the land and those to whom it belonged. I was horrified about some of what I learned. Across from one congressional hearing room where they discuss costly military garb called dragon skin to be used for desert warfare, there was a large display of semi-automatic weapons. Our group started singing across from the guns until they let us out. People, this is actually in the Capitol building, the arms display. When I wrote about this in a poem, I remembered tapping in the hearing room on my paper using punctuation as a form of comfort music. From the rooftop of the Federal Reserve, I imagined shrinking colorful numbers flying toward the Midwest. In a protest at the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank, a staff person took my camera and smashed my head. I grabbed it back and saved the photo card. Her picture appears in Practical Water on page 31. Janet and I took anti-war poems to Michelle, our representative chief of staff, and asked if we could read to her. She listened, and we spoke about the poems we had brought. In a less friendly moment, I told my congressman if he didn't stop voting for the war funding, he would end up in my poem for eternity. I was surprised when his staff person called my department at St. Mary's to say he had voted against the war funding. What is the job of a poet? Once at a die-in, I thought maybe this is the opposite of a poem. Then I thought, no, poetic space and political space are not two different spaces. Poetry is not a decoration to be used just for weddings and funerals. Poetry is active and vital. Over the years, I learned a lot about the legislative processes, how to negotiate with elected officials. I learned that most of our laws are made by young staffers who don't take lunch breaks. They do the real work, keeping track of how the votes go on any issue, learning their names and the names of the bills and keeping the names of the bills in your mind is key. I learned that most legislators focus on the powerful lobbyists, but we have power too. I learned the value of different kinds of discourse in my political poems, that one can mix data and magic to include several models of reality. When I began putting documents and poems in my books on the elements, not many contemporaries were doing that. I looked to Muriel Rukeyser's poetry, to Teresa Ha-Kung Cha's dictée, to Denise Levertov's anti-war hybrid poems. Ed Saunders wrote Poem from Jail on toilet paper. Bella Akmadulina wrote poems in jail on bars of soap. After the fly incident in Washington, I realized that writing in a narrative space, bringing names and documents into poems, might be outside the literary mainstream at the time, but it is important to write what you want to read and to do it with heart. Emerging poets, please don't forget those who have cut paths for you to navigate seemingly incompatible truths. And if you don't find models for what you want to do, make them yourself. Many quiet poems of moral vision may not seem political at first. There's a poem by Thomas Tronstromer, translated by Robert Bly, that offers a critique of bourgeois life with no moral bromides or pronouncements. Below freezing. We are at a party that doesn't love us. Finally, the party lets the mask fall and shows what it is, a shunting station for freight cars. In the fog, coal giants stand on their tracks, a scribble of chalk on the car doors. One can't say it aloud, but there's a lot of repressed violence here. That is why the furnishings seem so heavy, and why it is so difficult to see the other thing present, a spot of sun that moves over the house walls and slips over the unaware forest of flickering faces, a biblical saying never set down, "Come unto me, for I am as full of contradictions as you." I work the next morning in a different town. I drive there in a hum through the dawning hour that resembles a blue cylinder. Orion hangs over the frost. Children stand in a silent waiting for the school bus, the children no one prays for. The light grows as gradually as our hair. The furnishings of the interior setting are heavy from absorbing the mood of spiritual vacancy in this poem. The loveless party of adults in a zone of existential heaviness, a place of unrealized suffering, merges into the scene of a morning commute and the sight of solitary children at the bus stop. I often think of this line, "The children no one prays for." Yet there is a surreal empathy in the image of the blue cylinder and the observations of the driver, in which an almost magical property is introduced. And here is a piece by Paul Celan, brilliantly translated by Ben Friedlander. I keep this poem near my desk at all times. Eternity decays. In Serviteri, the asphodels ask each other white. With mumbling ladles, out of death kettle, over stone, they spoon soup in every bed and camp. The power of this poem begins in the first two dramatic words, eternity decays. Recent correspondence with Ben Friedlander illuminates his choices. He writes, the German is die Ewigkeit, altert. Ages or gets old would be more literal, but the reference to Serviteri nudged me toward decay. The single metaphor, that of a death kettle, sits beside the asphodels that are personified in a classic way. This eerie, mystical poem depicts the history of the Holocaust collapsed in the image of a death kettle time when even eternity will end. In Friedlander's breathtaking English rendering, ladle and kettle rhyme. The demotic, the temporal, and the eternal are compressed. Ceylon's poetry comes from a precarity and a receptivity that might have an end in mind, but no control. I want to talk about risk-taking, keeping categories loose, operating in uncertainty and process, and questioning subjectivity and ego in ways that will help you. All these things apply in poetry and activism. I still have much to learn. These 4 things, risk-taking, keeping categories loose, operating in uncertainty, and remaking your subjectivity, are all practical tools. Life is very large. I learned there's no such thing as the not poem. Every bit of it can go with poetry. By now, I've sat on many panels on activism and poetry, and the categories do not always seem to relate. Community organizers see language as a tool for getting messages across. Practicing to speak to media, we did many soundbite exercises in case a reporter came and said, "What brings you out here today?" You're supposed to do that answer in 30 seconds. Besides the poems chosen for rallies and political events, sometimes deploy obvious rhetorical strategies or are insistently declamatory. When I tried to introduce my activist friends to innovative poetry I love, at first they did not get it. The word siloed comes to mind. Modernist poetry is siloed and political organizing is siloed. Microsoft puts a little red squiggle under siloed. I used to think you couldn't read subtle or spiritual poetry at a political rally, but in fact, you can bring all kinds of poetry anywhere. Poets need not conform to the preachy or to the polemical. A group of us protested with Occupy in West Oakland while reading Robert Duncan's poem beginning with a line by Pindar, passing the poem back and forth. It is the same with stretching your imagination about beings that are there, beings that were there before you, showing respect for the foxes that are in the hills not far away. In one city block, there are thousands of miles of spider webs. Each orb weaver spider has 8 eyes. They're not very good eyes. Later that month at Occupy Cal, Bob and I had a less friendly meeting with Berkeley law enforcement when we opposed removal of tents on Cal campus, and I somehow caught sight of a row of ants going about their business on a wall during this brutal encounter. I think, Jeb, that might be, yeah, there they are. We got really close. As an aside, I will say that my theory is that if you move very close up to law enforcement at a protest and you're older, they're less likely to bash you because they're going to try to be respectful. So Bob and I moved up to the front there. That's why I got such a good picture. I caught sight of a row of ants going about their business on a wall during this brutal encounter. The ants went in my poem that appears in the Fire book, and so did a long rift down the page. Uncertainty is a quality of poets and community activists share. Uncertainty about outcomes, to abide in doubt, to accommodate both process thinking and disappointment. Neither poets nor activists know what will happen at the end of a particular composition or action. Uncertainty is crucial to the poetic process and to political organizing. Activism is not like flossing. You don't have to reach every tooth, and pre-imagined outcomes can be given up. A poet's power derives from powerlessness, traveling straight into the paradox where poems are impossible utterances. One winter, Bob and I met Janet Wheel and Kat Factor at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, where they fly the Predator drones. We did a vigil for a few days, reading poetry outside the base as the enlisted folks drove in. Police came by and showed us the line we couldn't cross. As we were being observed and as eyeless drones flew very close overhead, I tried imagining, as Joni Mitchell writes in Woodstock, that the drones turned into butterflies, or at least wasps with dangly legs. We flattened our books and held them up for the drone to photograph, so like that. Imagining young pilots flying the drones inside the base in their shorts, looking at a poem instead of practicing to kill someone at a wedding in Yemen. This became part of the process. I spoke last week about the use of trance or the waking dream. This can be useful during stressful actions. Behaving unconventionally like this may seem embarrassing, but using robots to kill or bomb helpless people half a world away is intolerable. Several years ago, some graduate students and I organized Profits Not Profits and went to Martinez, California to read poems near the sites of the oil refineries. We invoked a figure from ceremonial magic, the angel of the third altitude, a childlike figure of innocence dressed with bay and laurel leaves to join us metaphorically. Some went into the refinery office to ask if we could read poems to them. They said no, of course, and sent a white truck to follow us and make sure we weren't terrorists. As we read poems facing the refineries at Valero and Chevron, Ross Bilott, a poet who had once worked in the petroleum industry, told us about the bacteria that are used in the refining process. And as we faced the large vats, I thought of the tiny beings, wondering what their experience is like. Later, drafting a poem, I included those beings. Would those in the white trucks develop alternative energy sources to save the wildlife destroyed by the process of extraction? We felt as vulnerable as the planet. A few months later, after Trump started to dismantle environmental protections, we took the same action to a suburban shopping center wearing Russian gas masks we had purchased on the internet. Grassy hills with their so-called invasive species surrounded us. After we began our action, an older white guy came up to us and asked what we were doing. I said we were reading ecological poetry outdoors as part of a class because the EPA was in trouble. He said he owned the Safeway and we would have to take our protest elsewhere. I thought of the gas tank of his Volvo, full of screaming dead animals from the Cretaceous, a 40 million year geologic period of shallow inland seas, a phrase I've always found comforting. We moved our action to a different spot and continued reading. The rubber tubes of our gas masks, used perhaps in the Soviet era, looked like the snouts of ancient anteaters dangling down over the pages or our phones. At first, it was hard to see the poems through the scratched eye goggles, and then we got the hang of it. I wondered what happened to our interlocutor. How would he live out his days without poetry? During Obama years, Bob and I were invited to come to DC to protest Keystone Pipeline with a couple of prominent environmental groups. It was the first time the Sierra Club proposed civil disobedience to bring awareness at a time when Obama was wavering under pressure from the fossil fuel industry about going ahead with the pipeline. Some blocked passage and some chained themselves to the White House fence. There was a priest available because it was Ash Wednesday. So we got ashes put on so it would be less embarrassing for St. Mary's when I got arrested. Capitol Hill Police put us into police vans and took us to the station in Maryland to be booked. When the young cop was writing up my arrest, he asked if I had tattoos or identifying marks. I described my two tattoos for him. I didn't realize what I was experiencing in that moment until I tried to write about it in a poem. We were both white, but I realized I couldn't cross the chasm of class to ask him about the tattoo on his wrist. I will read the poem on April 7th. The planet is endangered for everyone, but becoming aware of my whiteness in such white spaces, realizing intersections between racial and class issues has been an important thing that connects me to the subjective stance in my poems. In the last 7 or 8 minutes, I'd like to talk about 3 subjectivities: a multiple or polyphonic speaker, a spiritually risky speaker, and a speakerless presentation of other vocabularies. When poets explore subjectivity, it can be instructive for their poems. As I wrote about the elements, secondary Brendas and nano Brendas kept poking in and out of my language. There are hundreds of other subjectivities in each of us as we try to grow our souls. In this poem, Cesar Vallejo, activist, inventor, interrogator of modernism, uses a polyphonic or multiple speakingness in one of the poems from his experimental text, Trilce. The translator is H.R. Hayes. Trilce 18. Oh, the 4 walls of the cell. Ah, the 4 whitening walls, which never fail to add up to the same number. Seedbeds of nerves, evil aperture, how it snatches from its 4 corners at the daily chained extremities. Kind turnkey of innumerable keys, if you were here, if you could see till what hour these walls remain 4, we should both be against them, we too, more too than ever. And neither should you weep. Speak, O liberator. Ah, the walls of the cell. Meanwhile, I am hurt all the more by the 2 long ones which, this night, possess something of mothers already dead, each leading a child by the hand down bromine steeps. And I am left alone, the right hand upraised, which serves for both, seeking the 3rd arm which, between my where and my when, must look for man's powerless superiority. I admire the depth in multiple stances as Vallejo stretches, breaks open, and twists vocabulary and grammar to express his political disappointment and hopes, radically mixing autochthonous languages with Spanish. Trilce was published in 1922, before the Spanish Civil War. The poet was in Paris, questioning the pure aesthetics of modernism. Whether he's remembering the cell walls from his jail time in Peru or describing a hotel room in Paris where he was actually starving, he is addressing aspects of himself and an internalized lover with an inclusive subjectivity that is angular, intimate, and mythic. As a Marxist, he was conflicted about whether art is pleasurable or decorative, and many of his poems present paradoxes and tormented dualities, entre mi donde y mi cuando, between my where and my when, a search that both is and isn't personal. Solmaz Sharif writes in The End of Exile about returning to a place of family origin, Shiraz, Iran, and in doing so allows a speaker of spiritual risk, an almost diaphanous voice to inform the writing. Here is the second half of that piece. Turning down Shiraz's streets, it turns out to be such a faraway thing, a without which I have learned to be. From bed, I hear a man in the alley selling something, no longer by mule and holler, but by bullhorn and jalopy. How to say what he is selling. It is no thing, this language thought worth naming, no thing I have used before. It is his life I don't see daily. Not theater, not play, though I remain only audience. It is a thing he must sell daily, and every day he peddles this thing, without which I cannot name, without which is my life. The open syntax of this spare poem allows prepositions both to float and also to control the action. The poet draws us into a journey of return to a city where her family roots lie, and the speaker senses a deep connection, but remains only audience and no thing. The poem ends up with a powerful without which I cannot name, without which is my life. The poem demonstrates what it means to be in and to perform this absence with a sense of negative capability in order to be in a life of active absence, active nothing, bringing simultaneously a sense of searching bafflement and an openness about the relationship between the individual and her family history. The last poem I will share is by Forrest Gander, whose poetry and translations forge profound relationships between the self, the planet, and language. This is from the title poem of Gander's forthcoming book, Twice Alive. In the presence of water, photobionts go turgid. In hours of dark respiration, a spermatic green corn smell takes the shape of a lamellated mushroom, incavitating symplasts. Spores loosen into the elongation zone on a night of caterwauling loons. So evening finds us at this wood's edge, where at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Gander doesn't just pursue the sensuality of the scientific vocabulary, photobiont, respiration, lamellated, symplasts, and rhizomes. He makes organic and inorganic connections to shake up the very idea of the subjective self when one is an onlooker. The poet reaches more deeply into the human order, not to center it, but to get past the ego to a place where the language and the earth touch and meld with the noticing. Gander and other ecologically committed poets like Ed Roberson and Brian Tier offer bridges between perception and special vocabularies, suggesting that there is an observing self that is collective and personal, a language for lichen and a raccoon, a drought-driven wildfire that will keep the subject both emotion-driven and lyrical, but also dispersed. New subjectivities are emerging in ecopoetics, which can loosely be defined as poetry written in relationship to current environmental concerns. Such poetry recalls that humans are not the center, but only one of 8 million other species. The human gut microbiome is a condominium of at least 300 species of bacteria. I have as much respect for bacteria as I have for poets, which is actually quite a lot, as I mentioned in the refinery action. Such poetry brings together some of the values I've spoken of tonight: emphasis on process, the hope of justice, the decentered self that interrogates otherness. What is your experience? We can ask the hills or bodies of water. What is the experience of shale, not yet mined for its oil? Magical thinking is sometimes a term of contempt in our utilitarian culture, but it might mean using intuitive functions. Our knowledge is deepening. I want to close these lectures on a couple of hopeful notes. I want to ask that you start envisioning some small actions you can do. If you're a poet, it's easy to see why you think art is your great and main task, and it is. The values of poetry and art can transform a culture that fattens itself on retaliatory violence. So please go on writing and tuck this request for when the vaccinations are further along. Our great sensitivity as poets need not make us incapable of going outside of our comfort zones. We can hold our new leadership accountable for combating systemic racism, injustice, and planetary endangerment. Some actions involve the patient work of legal processes or the daily work, as Claudia Rankin suggests, of having difficult conversations. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States. After the anti-racism protests of last summer, I thought of things I want to do as a older middle-class white woman in a mixed neighborhood when it is safe to do so. I want to go talk to my police chief. The thought made me immediately uncomfortable, so I knew I was on the right track. What do you do when you are too tired or too stressed? I practice my Baptist childhood concept of tithing, but I tithe my energy, not money, at a rate of 10% of what is available. If I am low energy this week, my tithe is to write a single letter, but to write by hand, not email, and to use a stamp. If I feel peppy this week, I can organize something or conceive of an action. Once when I had energy, I took my crypto-animist activism to Sacramento, but I'm a tired grandmother now, and I want to inspire you others, not only with poems, but with my request that you try going toward what makes you uncomfortable to take part in acts of love and justice. If you were at University of Virginia, I have an idea for an action we could do together if I were there, and I'd love to share it with you, but not on the internet, so please email me. I want to thank everyone for your interest in poetry as readers, artists, scientists, and other thinking people. Please keep poetry in your lives. Perhaps neither the actions I describe nor poetry will change anything, but the values they represent will help a lot. I hope in my 3 talks I've offered some helpful tools on metaphor, metonymy, meaning, mystery, magic, and morality. I could have written 100 pages on any of these topics. Thank you so much for your attention over these weeks, and I invite you to join me in a life of radical hope, love, and imagination. And finally, here's a picture of Bromelina menziesii, which is the California state lichen, just because it's beautiful. It drips down. It's a fruticose species. And now I will be happy to answer some questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Brenda. Just as the questions start coming in, I might just mention that I loved it when you said we felt as vulnerable as the planet. I might be paraphrasing there, but I think I remember you saying that, and that seems such an important connection between, especially as we maybe are sitting in our own places right now and thinking about what poetry and what activism might be, thinking about that vulnerability that's shared seems to be a really important connection. We've got some thank yous coming in and a few questions. And so I might just start with the earliest one and just read the question out. There's a reference to Plato. Do you think Coleridge's revision of primary imagination holds any validity? His notion of secondary imagination concedes to Plato that imagination is basically reconfiguration. But the word magic would imply original energy, as Whitman put it. Where might you stand on some of these terms?
That's a very fancy academic question. Thanks for starting with a tough one. Well, I mean, needless to say, well, the Romantics were always trying to parse out what it meant to imagine and which direction it's coming from, whether it's actually the juice out there that we're receiving from from nature, or whether we're providing it, which was more of Coleridge's stance, which is why he faulted himself so much. And I just feel like, I mean, obviously Plato didn't really hate poets. He just thought that they that we screwed things up by our fanciful behaviors. And oddly enough, the Romantics themselves were disappointed activists in some way, or at least Wordsworth and Coleridge were having a sense of, that they had to retreat from the dramatic revolution, the dramatic French Revolution. But yeah, I mean, I think the idea of multiple imaginations and multiple types of imagination, and needless to say, my talk is about trying to merge moral imagination with what I think is the fairly whacked out version of the imagination, or maybe Coleridge would call it fancy, that we often get accused of, or snagged, or or isolated with, but I think they can be brought together. I hope they can.
Thank you, Brenda. Here's another question. You pay attention to syllables as sound, microsonata, punctuation as comfort music, are some examples mentioned. And so the question is, can you talk more about what perhaps magic syllables do or can do?
Wow, that's a great question too. I spoke last time a little bit about that, I think, but just the idea that that we sometimes we receive this immediate energy through the sound itself. I think what I was referring to in the punctuation moment was that I'm just aware that punctuation is often kind of overlooked as a very powerful force in our poetry. I ended up kind of decorating poems in there. When I started writing about geology, I ended up decorating poems with punctuation just because I liked the look of it. And so in the action I was describing, I was tapping a lot with my pencil to create punctuation in that stressful moment of thinking about the dragon skin, because I don't know, I in that particular moment I found it fairly unbearable to think that we were facilitating this thing of so much suffering, and sitting there with the congressional people actually arguing how much it's worth to protect the human body from 120-degree heat. So I just started tapping with my pencil and writing lots more punctuation. The poem Dragon Skin has that action in it, where you just add extra punctuation for almost somatic reasons. But yeah, I do feel like punctuation has a sort of abstract or magical power, maybe, that we don't often take advantage of. I want to do a shout out for, I don't know if they're listening, but to C.A. Conrad, just because they engage in a lot of somatic ritual actions, and they are such a powerful poet, you know, with that shape, the shape of the poem on the page and the look. That's just very important in connecting that way. Yeah.
Thank you, Brenda. Another question: how do you feel you have evolved as a poet over the course of your career? And what were the major experiences that served as the impetus of your evolution? And I'm adding to this person's questions, but I'm thinking especially in terms of those points that you're talking about tonight, in particular.
Wow, that's that's an entire lecture series in itself. I can't possibly answer that question, but I think I can just sort of send you to the poems in some way. I mean, you can read a little bit about the journey, you know, on various websites or whatever. But I started out as a fairly much more conventional lyric poet with a very specific idea of a kind of wild, in some way wild surrealist lyric poem that had a particular look and flavor. And I've developed a lot over 4 decades in several different directions, and included a lot of different formal devices, subject matter, and it's been very much a journey of trying to figure out the soul in language, the language in soul, and to also speak to the earth and its zones through my poetry. So, yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Brenda. Here's a question kind of around maybe a pragmatic concern for poets or writers. You said that poets that a poet's power derives from powerlessness. How do you navigate the tension of political rhetoric to state clearly what is right and what is wrong? How exactly can we enact this in our poetics when speaking out against injustice?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, I feel like some of the examples that I gave, that that there is rhetorically powerful poetry that's political and moral, that speaks directly into those zones. And I gave the example of Blake's London and Ginsberg's Howl, and certainly Audre Lorde's poetry, and, you know, Audrey Rich. I just feel like there is a huge range when it comes to a sort of subtle and moral stance that we can take, and that belongs in the conversation too. And that part of what I wanted to introduce tonight was the idea that we're not necessarily, we don't necessarily have to go for the polemical, especially when we're speaking to questions of environmental justice, and we're speaking for non-human creatures, and we're speaking for creatures that don't have voices, that maybe the strategies that we're used to with political rhetoric are less useful. And so I would sort of refer everyone to the large number of amazing anthologies that are, and I can certainly suggest some if you email me, but of eco-poetics anthologies that are doing just such a huge range of work in this way. It's I think it's a real zone of development. Yeah.
Thanks. Are you okay for a few more questions?
Yeah. I love doing Q&A.
Great. What is the greatest factor in determining the length of your poems? Were the poems you, for example, were the poems you penned while protesting testament to the moment or fragments of future work?
Wow. Okay. So, well, I intend to give a series of talks about revision, because revision for me is a way of life. It's not a sort of cleaning up something that's already pretty finished when you start. So I start usually with fragments of ideas. With the poems that I'm describing, a lot of the poems that I talked about in the middle of my talk are in Practical Water, and they have a lot of narrative fragment in them. So normally I would work out of notebooks, and the impulse, whether I write okay, I'm going to say something I'll probably regret, and it's going to be on the internet for eternity, but I'll say it. I feel like that whether I'm working on a 6-line poem, I write 3 kinds of poems: short, medium, and long. And whether I'm working on a very, very short poem, 12 lines, 6 lines, 12 lines, a medium, like 1 or 2 page lyric, or a sequence of poems that takes 10 or 12 pages, I always want it to have the impulse of one lyric breath, which is what drew me to poetry in the first place. And if I don't have that sort of magical sense of the lyric breath, one would be, an example would be, Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium. Okay, that poem is, to me, a lyric powerhouse. So if I'm drawn to a 12 line or 12-page poem, I still want people to be able to read it as if it just, and if it doesn't sound like that, I just keep working, and I just keep working, not just days, but months, years. I want it to sound like it just came out of my head whole. And determining whether it's going to be short or long, you have to let the poem determine that. You can't tell it in advance what it's going to be, which is why I get upset about coming to workshop and having the having the students say, well, I know it's going to be this or X or Y, Z. You don't know that in advance. You have to ask the poem. I don't know. That might have confused that person. Okay.
Thank you.
Maybe a couple more easy ones.
Okay. This might be an easy one. You mentioned that the Paul Celan poem.
Yeah.
And there's a question here of recommendations of poems that you might turn to that are particularly hopeful.
Oh boy. Well, so very, 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 very many. I talked last time about Paul Celan being a go-to poet for me, and this poet, Chuvash poet Gennady Aigi, who's been somebody I've been turning to a lot during Peter France's translations. Just love that poet. Yeats, been doing a lot of Yeats. But it doesn't need to be cheerful for me to get comfort. That's the distinction I think people especially American readers have to get over, like Terence Hayes, great poet, who's, it's not classic comfort. Um, and so I think we have to go to the zone that where somebody's wisdom makes us feel better, even if it's not the good news. How is the poet's wisdom getting through this time? Bob and I are in a group, and we've been reading a Yeats poem, and Yeats is one of my go-to poets. He's not full of good news. Dickinson isn't full of good news, but they are go-to poets, great, great poets. Yeah, so a gazillion poets I could recommend. that's a little short list.
I'm just remembering there's a page on your website that has recommended reading as well. So if that would be new or interesting to anyone who's listening, that's a place to turn to in terms of that question.
I have to revise my website, by the way. It's just so outdated. I used to keep up with it. I don't know how to do it myself. I needed to get help. So but I do want to remind people about Poem a Day that Academy of American Poets does. Poetry Foundation's website is so full of amazing stuff, and Poetry Society of America, so full of such great resources that we have. Maybe two more questions, and then I want to read a Ferlinghetti poem before we say goodnight.
Cool. That sounds great. Would you be able to speak to your choice of the translation for the Vallejo poem? I know there's a few translations, and some thoughts are being expressed there in the chat. I'm maybe curious about your preference around the translation there.
I have some Portuguese. I don't have Spanish, and I liked that translation. That translation I discovered in an old edition of an old copy of Ironwood. Ironwood was a great magazine that Michael Cudahy did for a lot of years, and it was in a very old Ironwood that had a selection of of Hayes's translations. And for some reason, I gravitated toward those translations really early. And I'd be really happy to know if people, have very strong preferences. The Vallejo is so very difficult to translate, and so I think, and that text in particular is so full of nuance and different vocabularies, that there's a lot of there are a lot of different possibilities for translating that text.
Cool, thank you. Okay, maybe our last question. You mentioned that you have to ask the poem what it wants. Do you think a poem has its own subjectivity or spirit? I know it's meta, this person says, but what does that mean possibly in the context of an eco-poetics?
I know, I always get in trouble. Like, do you really believe the orchids talk? I do not think it's fair for me to weigh in on the orchids. But I don't, of course I don't with one half of my brain believe that the poem has an idea. But I would say there's a great essay by Walter Benjamin about the idea that language, for poetic language, almost pre-exists until it makes its way into its form. And once it's made its way into its form, it then exists from its, sort of almost mystical state. It finds its form and it exists. Is the poet participating? Of course, the poet is doing it, but at some level, I do hold out the possibility that we're overhearing something in the universe that doesn't have to do with us. Now, I'm not going to give it a name or anything like that. That's for you to name, but I believe I'm overhearing things sometimes, and that it may or may not have to do with my participation in it. And so I just would like to remain a bit agnostic over whether I'm the entire maker of my poem, or whether the universe is in part making it too. And I hope that's not fudging, but I think, as you can see with these 3 talks, I have been, my whole purpose was to sit on the fence with a lot of these divisions. And I insist on that my fence is very handy. So anyway, I really am grateful for all of your great questions. And thank you to Andy. Thank you to Jeb. Thank you to Lisa and all the creative writing students, and to all of you audience members out there. And thanks to my beloved Bob Hass upstairs, and our friend Jesse Nathan, who's been on hand in case we had technical troubles, which we didn't. And shout out to all the grandkids if you're out there having dinner. Okay, I'm going to read from my high school copy of Coney Island of the Mind. This was one of my first poetry books ever. And I still love his open look on the page. I think he's a great. And so, Lawrence, thank you for your spirit, and I believe you still exist. So this is part 15 of Coney Island of the Mind title poem. Constantly risking absurdity and death whenever he performs above the heads of his audience, the poet, like an acrobat, climbs on rhyme to a high wire of his own making, and balancing on I-beams above a sea of faces, paces his way to the other side of day, performing entre-chat and sleight of foot tricks and other high theatrics, and all without mistaking anything for what it may not be. For he's the super realist who must perforce perceive taught truth before the taking of each stance or step in his supposed advance toward that still higher perch where beauty stands and waits with gravity to start her death-defying leap. And he, a little Charlie Chaplin man who may or may not catch her fair eternal form spread-eagled in the empty air of existence. So that's Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Coney Island of the Mind. And thanks for all your attention and your poems, and keep poetry in your life. And students, I hope to see some of you tomorrow for office hours. Okay, good night, everybody.